Welcome everybody to Connecting the Universe. I'm author and researcher Mike Ricksecker, back at you with another class here out of the secret library of the Connected Universe. We're going to be talking about time slips and interdimensional phasing tonight. Many of you probably have not heard the term interdimensional phasing, but time slips, yeah, we have an idea about that. And those who have been frequent here to Connecting the Universe are aware that time travel is a rather favorite topic of mine. I like Sarah here. Sorry I am late. Time slipped away from me. I think that is pun intended. And Tom is asking, wouldn't time slips be more random than predicted? Yeah, we're going to kind of get into that and try to figure out how some of these things may actually be happening. So let's kind of get into it. Okay, time slip. So I have talked on this a little bit before when we've talked about time travel, interdimensional beings, this sort of thing. We have hit this topic. So those listen to the podcast later, you can go back and listen to those. Or I do have some videos up on the Mike Ricksecker YouTube channel that you can kind of dive into on this. And what I think it all comes down to is frequency, energy, vibration, resonance, that sort of thing. Everything in this universe comes down to those fundamental connections. But let's actually take a look at what a time slip is, which is basically two moments in time that are resonating or vibrating at the same frequency for a moment where you get a glimpse of another. And this is, I'm not going to get all into stack time theory tonight, but this kind of adheres to the idea that all time is concurrent, past, present, future. Two of those moments that are in that stack happen to hit the right frequency for a moment and they get a glimpse of each other, like I said just a moment ago. So what I'm going to do here is I have some clips from a little bit of an older video that I have up there on the YouTube channel, Time Traveler. So I'm going to let myself kind of talk about a few of these different time slip events. We're going to start with the one of the older stories here, and that is with the Versailles time slip. On August 10th, 1901, Eleanor Jourdain and Charlotte Annie Moberly, two middle-aged English women, were walking through the palace gardens of Versailles in France, seeking out a building called the Petit Trianon. As they searched the grounds, they suddenly noticed that the other people around them were dressed in very different clothing and looked very similar to those during the 18th century prior to the French Revolution. Specifically, they saw a man on the step of a summer house who appeared completely out of time, pockmarked with smallpox, and another woman in an 18th century gown drawing a sketch of Marie Antoinette. The two women also spotted a plow in the garden, but the gardeners at the time stated there was no longer a garden plow at Versailles, although one had been there during the reign of King Louis XVI. After the women reported their sightings, others began to come forth to report that they had also seen outdated people roaming the gardens of Versailles, including Claire M. Burrow, who claimed that she had actually walked through a gate which had been sealed up for over a century. That video is kind of interesting to watch because that was basically when I first moved in here. Then Sarah asks, in order to experience a time slip, would the outsider have to be outside of time? No, they would not have to be outside of time. We're going to see that in some of these examples where there are interactions between the two different parties. So they do not have to be outside of time. That would be more of like, an observer. Somebody who's in the fifth dimension and they can kind of freely move in and around time, which certainly could happen. And that may be why we see like some of these shadows or apparitions or wisps or whatever just move super, super fast, that they may be actually some sort of fifth dimensional being that we're getting just a glimpse of. With a time slip, both observers are within, traditionally people call it the river of time, but I will say they're both within the stack of time, but that moment is just on the same frequency or resonating at the same frequency for just a moment, and they see each other, but they're both in time. So let's take a look at another one. It's not as far back in history, but is again another quite an interesting tale here. It was 1935 when Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard of the British Royal Air Force may have gotten a glimpse of the future of the RAF. On a flight from Edinburgh, Scotland to Andover, England,
He flew over an abandoned airfield from Drim not long after he took off from Edinburgh. The old airfield was in complete disarray, overgrown with foliage being eaten by cattle, and hangars in shambles after much disuse. Shortly thereafter, a storm whipped up, and the high winds caused his plane to spiral toward the ground. Goddard pulled out of it, but then discovered that his plane was headed right back over Drim. As he flew over the airfield again, the skies opened up to bright sunshine, and he could see a much different vision of the airfield. The foliage was gone, and the hangars looked brand new. No longer abandoned, 4 planes were on the ground, 3 biplanes, and a monoplane painted yellow. The mechanics on the ground strangely didn't notice him, and they were all dressed in blue. It wouldn't be for another 4 years before the Royal Air Force began using a monoplane of the type Goddard spotted, started painting their planes yellow, and began dressing their mechanics in blue.
So another interesting story here. This is an aviation type story from the 1930s. And here, we have an example of seeing a glimpse of the future. What was the situation that he became an observer of this point in time rather than an interactive participant? Well, it seems like the catalyst here is the storm. We talked at the very beginning, those connections with energy, vibration, electricity, all of that. So what did the storm do to his place in time to put him back to, or actually would be putting him ahead a few years? So apparently, they refurbished the airfield. They started using it again. They changed uniforms. They painted planes, all this sort of thing a few years down the road.
It was dark and dank. The roadbed still wet with rain that had poured down for hours. A mist hung in the air, painting the aged sedan with fine droplets of water as the vehicle rambled down old Route 66. Up ahead on the right was a huddled figure in a brown trench coat and a tattered fedora, trudging up the road. As the car neared, the driver determined that the figure seemed to be an older gentleman and slowed, taking pity upon the old man and offering a ride out of the horrible weather. However, when the driver pulled up, the figure disappeared into the mist. Could the appearance and disappearance of ghosts and apparitions actually be a form of time travel? Let's take a look at a couple of examples. There's a strip of historic Route 66 in Oklahoma that runs from El Reno to Weatherford, which seems to be most particularly haunted. The visage of an old man on the roadside has a number of variations. As described earlier, some people have tried to offer him a ride, but he will simply vanish into thin air. One person actually enticed him into the car and described him as an eerie little man. Suddenly, the man tried to jump out of the car after it started moving, so the driver pulled over to let him out. However, the man was no longer in the car and was not spotted anywhere nearby. A few miles down the road, the driver saw the gentleman walking along the roadside the same way as he had before. Other drivers have stated the apparition jumps out into the road and they think they've hit him. However, when they get out of their cars to check, not a soul is around. Apparitions like this seem to be a glimpse of the past, our place in space and time enmeshing with another. Sometimes the ghosts look at us as if we are the ghosts. And if this is true, then while we're receiving a glimpse of the past, these souls from the past are receiving a glimpse of the future.
Okay, there's a lot going on with that one. And just to kind of give a little shout out there, that the guy walking down the road there, that was my son Chase, many moons ago. Yeah, a lot of things going on with this particular ghostly vagabond, that you'll have these figures walking along the side of the road. They seem physical enough. They sometimes get into the car, so there's an actual physical interaction, and then they disappear. They scream like they want to get out, these different sorts of things, and then all of a sudden they're seen again later on. So those 2 points in time are enmeshed enough that they are able to have a physical interaction with each other, and then all of a sudden whatever frequency or wavelength that they were on for that moment just breaks, and all of a sudden he's gone. Kind of takes us into the Doppelganger shadow story that Jim Harold had related to me a couple years ago. We've talked about it here before when we've talked shadows. Young man, when he was a little boy, had walked into the kitchen one day, And there, standing by the kitchen table, was this tall, dark, shadowy, hooded figure. Scared him to death, ran out of the room. Years later, he's in the kitchen. He's at the kitchen table making a sandwich. He has a hoodie on. Sees this short shadow person walk into the kitchen and all of a sudden turn around, boom, take off. And he realized in that moment, oh my gosh, that was me when I was a little kid. And when I was a little kid, I saw myself more grown, just happened to be in a hoodie making a sandwich at the kitchen table. So here it is, a sort of doppelganger type of story. I mean, they did not look exactly the same because, one was short, one was tall, one was a kid, one was a young adult, or shadows, secondly, and they were two different points in time. So what was going on here? What was so special about that moment that those two moments were vibrating, I would say, almost at the right frequency? It wasn't perfect because they only saw each other as shadows. They didn't see themselves fully formed. Where in other cases, people do see fully formed individuals, but these only came off as shadows. So whatever vibration or resonance was going on at that moment between those two different moments in time, it wasn't quite perfect enough, but enough for them to be able to at least see each other a little bit. We're going to hit the Conjuring House. This is, of course, my good friend Andrea Perrin, one of the most fascinating stories, and she will say it was the most fascinating thing that ever happened at the house with all the different things that happened there. It was this particular thing, and that was the time slip. And this is more of her mother's story, but it involves Andrea as well. Carolyn was up. Andrea said, would you like something to eat? I can make you some coffee, etc. Yes, goes into the kitchen to start doing those different things. Carolyn was in the parlor. And as she's sitting there and Andrea's back off in the kitchen, Carolyn sees in the dining room, this used to be the dining room, all of a sudden appear an entire family at this fireplace, which at the time was boarded up and had been boarded up for 100 years. All of a sudden it was open, there was a raging fire, and there was a woman cooking over it. There were a couple of children running around in here, like through that doorway there. And then in the middle was a long table. There were two men sitting there with pewter steins, and they turned and looked at Carolyn, who was back in the parlor over here. One said to the other, well, would you look at that? As if Carolyn was the ghost. So Carolyn basically saw them as like this ghostly family in the dining room, while they saw her as a ghostly person sitting there in the parlor. So that story in and of itself is absolutely fascinating. So then the question becomes, what made it happen? Straight above that is Andrea Perrin's bedroom, which is, looking at this photo through that doorway, basically what we're looking at here, everything in the foreground of this photo is stationary. But once you get to that wall and that doorway with the interior window, but within that room, something is going on with the energy. I got dizzy there earlier that day, just standing basically right on the other side of that interior window. Something goes on there. And everything you can see here is suddenly shifted to the right. There is a window back behind this wall piece. From that interior window to the doorway, there's a small section of wall. Directly behind that wall in the other room is an exterior window today. And that entire thing is shifted to the right and is covering that chalkboard. It is, I call it interdimensional phasing. It is phasing for sure. I call it interdimensional because of the nature of this house and the things that go on there. From that doorway, that's where, Carl Johnson had witnessed the shadow smoke. Andrea has seen the shadow smoke around that area too. There is something that happens there. This is the most basic way to kind of show what a phase shift is without getting too crazy technical. Oh my gosh, Mike is going to throw math at you. Yes, you see sine and cosine waves here. But that is basically the idea, that one wave is shifted horizontally, could be before, could be after, from the initial onset of the wave. I'm not going to get into the all the math there on the side. And a really, really interesting example of this, and it's also what a lot of people call a doppelganger story. Emily Saget. She was a French school teacher. The tale was first chronicled by Robert Dale Owen in his Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World. This was a book that came out in 1860, and it had a lot of different interesting stories about real life experiences that people had that were paranormal, supernatural nature, esoteric, strange stuff, things that were just unexplained. This here is not a photo of Emily Saget. There is no photo of her. We're just using an example of a school teacher in a historic setting. But basically, she taught at Pizionat Don Novelka, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's in modern-day Latvia. But she taught there in 1845. It was an elite boarding school attended by some of the most influential families of the time, including the daughter of Baron von Guldenstube, Julie, who's the one that put Owen onto this story. Poor girl. She started teaching at the age of 16. And when she taught there at this particular school, she was 32 years old. And in that time, it had 18 posts. And it wasn't because she was a bad teacher. In fact, when she eventually had to leave this particular school, they gave her glowing reviews and wrote her, letters of recommendation, all that, because she was actually a very, very good teacher. And she was a very nice person, very helpful, all that. Everybody loved her. But she had to go because of, one day she's writing something on the chalkboard. She's whatever point that she was making, she apparently was getting very passionate about. And then all of a sudden, there was a second personage of her off to the side, looking as if she was writing on the chalkboard, but she had no chalk in hand. Another time, she was helping a girl getting ready for a garden party and hooking the dress, getting her put together and all that. And the girl looks in the mirror as Emily's taking care of her, and all of a sudden she sees another Emily right next to her, looking as if she is also hooking the dress, making the same exact movements. Other times, she's sitting down at dinner with the girls and with the staff, eating, knife, fork, spoon, all that stuff, and all of a sudden, transposed from her is another one of her, making the exact same movements. So what is going on here? Now, we were just talking about what we're calling a phase shift, one image moving horizontally from the other. So we take a look at Emily here. Well, again, this is not really Emily. This is just a historic photo of a school teacher. This is kind of what they would have seen all of a sudden, where all of a sudden you have a second school teacher off to the side. This would be what we would call a phase shift. So the question then becomes, what made her do this? It's not, we were talking before storms, we were talking before location, we were talking before, little power plants in the basement of the Conjuring House. Well, if that was the case, if it was the building, the site, the location, some extenuating circumstances like a major storm that supercharged the area, then it would affect everybody. And you would have something more like this where the entire class would be shifted. The entire class would be transposed off to the side. But that's not what happened. It was just her. So something specifically was happening with Emily. Something was happening with her personal resonance frequency of vibration that was causing a projection of her to move off to the side. There are other strange events that happened with her. That in itself would be the phase shift. A lot of interesting things here to contemplate. And this is one of the rabbit holes that I'm diving down into with the new book. For those that are listening to the podcast version of this later, please join us every Wednesday night, 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time. You can watch all those video clips that we just did, see the full slide presentation and everything. Along with us, 30-day free trial, connecteduniverseportal.com. All right, everybody, till next time, if time really exists.